Point and counterpoint. Point. A movement's means create its ends, by Tom Regan and Gary Francione. Many animal advocates hold that there really is no difference between animal welfare and animal rights. Others claim that while there is a difference, advancing animal welfare is a necessary prerequisite to advancing animal rights. Given either assumption, many conscientious activists conclude that we must support welfarist means in our march toward animal rights ends. We believe these views are mistaken. Not only are the philosophies of animal rights and animal welfare separated by irreconcilable differences, and not only are the practical reforms grounded in animal welfare morally at odds with those sanctioned by the philosophy of animal rights, but also in the enactment of animal welfare measures actually impedes the achievement of animal rights. We emphasise at the outset that we do not intend to be critical of past activities of the movement or of the admirable efforts of individuals to end animal suffering. Rather, we are discussing the future direction of the movement as a matter of movement policy and the campaigns chosen by the movement pursuant to that policy. Fundamental differences. There are fundamental and profound differences between the philosophy of animal welfare and that of animal rights. Animal rights philosophy rests on the recognition of the moral inviolability of the individual, both human and non-human. Just as people of colour do not exist as resources for whites or women for men, so other animals do not exist as resources for human beings. The goal of the animal rights movement is nothing less than the total liberation of non-human animals from human tyranny. No one who accepts the philosophy of animal rights would be satisfied with the continuation of the society's rapacious consumption of farm animals, for example, even if the animals were raised in an ecologically sustainable fashion and were transported and slaughtered humanely. Animal welfarists, by contrast, are committed to the pursuit of gentle usage. They believe it morally permissible to use non-humans for human benefit, but think humans should try to minimise suffering. Thus, whereas welfarists seek to reform current practices of animal exploitation while retaining such exploitation in principle, rights advocates oppose all such exploitation in principle and seek to abolish all such exploitation in practice. Recognition of the moral inviolability of individual animals not only helps shape the ends that the animal rights movement seeks, it should also help articulate the morally acceptable means that may be used, and this is important. Many animal rights people who disavow the philosophy of animal welfare believe they can consistently support reformist means to abolition ends. This view is mistaken, we believe, for moral, practice and conceptual reasons. Moral concerns. The view that animal welfare means can be used to achieve animal rights ends rests on unsupported, implausible speculation about the future. For example, why should we believe that making animal model research more humane will persuade people in the future to stop using non-human animals in research? Why not draw the opposite conclusion, namely that the humane exploitation of non-human animals will lead to the indefinite perpetuation of such exploitation? By analogy, why think that permitting gentler rape or more humane slavery would lead to the absolute prohibition against rape and the total abolition of slavery? Clearly, when so much depends upon beliefs about the future, a minimal respect for rationality demands more than the minimal amount of empirical support. The thesis that reformist means will lead to abolitionist ends is entirely lacking in such support. More than troubling, a reformist response to animal oppression is morally inconsistent with the philosophy of animal rights. Advocates of this philosophy must reject the idea that the end justifies the means. Thus, they must refuse to support the institutionalised exploitation of some non-human animals today, no matter how humane, in the hope that other animals will benefit in the future. Since reformist measures necessarily authorise such exploitation, this is true by definition. Consistent animal rights advocates cannot support them. Practical concerns. The belief that making animal exploitation more humane through legislation now will help end it in the future is mistaken for a second reason. The real world doesn't work that way. For an example, we need look no further than the Federal Animal Welfare Act. Many of the supporters of the 1985 amendments due to the AWA argued that they were simply one step in the struggle to end vivisection. It is clear in hindsight that these expectations have remained miserably unfulfilled. Rather than hastening the demise of vivisection, the amendments fortified it through explicit congressional recognition of its legitimacy and gave vivisectors an unintensively strong law to point to when questioned about the abuse of animals in laboratories. For example, in a recent New England Journal of Medicine article, vivisectors pointing to the AWA and its amendments state that the public need not to be concerned about the treatment of animals because there are stringent regulations which carry the force of federal law governing the care and use of animals in medical research. What the authors do not point out, and what the American public does not know, is that the AWA prohibits unnecessary animal suffering, but leaves to the exclusive discretion of vivisectors the determination of what constitutes necessity. Moreover, as a result of the amendments which require that each research facility have an institutional animal care and use committee, vivisectors now argue that the committees provide animals protection equivalent to that provided by human experimentation review committees. What the vivisectors do not mention, however, is that the human experimentation requires the informed consent of the human subject, a crucial concept that cannot be applied in the context of animal experimentation, and that these committees are composed almost exclusively of other vivisectors, who for the most part rubber stamp what the vivisector wants. Small wonder then that many activists who worked for the 1985 amendments to the AWA now realise that the AWA serves as a most convenient tool in the biomedical industry's bag of public relations tricks. We should add that animal rights advocates who support animal welfare means are playing into the hands of the biomedical establishment's current strategy of portraying this temporary acceptance of animal welfare as proof of the dishonesty of the animal rights movement. In a recently published article, Patrick Concannon of Cornell Veterinary School argues that animal rights advocates often support welfarist reforms, but are not bound by any moral requirement to be truthful about their ultimate goals and intentions. The animal rights movement must be careful to ensure that these untruths do not succeed in creating an impression of the movement as dishonest in any sense. Conceptual concerns. The belief that animal welfare reforms advance the cause of animal rights is also mistaken conceptually. As long as humans have rights and non-humans do not, as it is the case in the welfarist framework, the non-humans will virtually always lose when their interests conflict with human interests. Thus, welfare reforms by their very nature can only serve to retard the pace at which animal rights goals are achieved. In order to understand this point, we need to remind ourselves of the nature of rights. In the ordinary course, rights are not subject to violations simply because others will benefit from that violation. For example, under US Constitution, many enjoy a right to liberty that may not be violated without due process. This right, among others, prevents people from being used in biomedical experiments against their will, even when such use would produce substantial benefits for many other people. The whole purpose of a right is to act as a barrier of sorts between the right holder and everyone else. In our society at the present time, and indefinitely into the future under the welfarist framework, only people have rights enforceable by law. Animals are regarded as the property of humans, and rather than having rights, animals are almost always regarded as the object of the exercise of rights on the part of humans. When we confront a situation with human and non-human interests conflict, we should attempt to balance those interests, but under the animal welfare framework, we balance two very dissimilar interests: the interest of the non-human animal, who is regarded as property and the object of the exercise of human rights, usually property rights, against the interest of the human right holder, and the animal is always bound to lose because by weighing the human right so heavily, a presumption in favour of exploitation is created. Thus, the moral framework established by the animal welfare philosophy guarantees that non-human animals will always lose when their interests are balanced against the claims of human rights. This moral framework can only serve to impede animal rights. Animal rights activism. Many animal advocates will agree with us to this point, but will then make the familiar change. We cannot end animal exploitation overnight. We must take things one step at a time, and we must be content with the reform of the system. The abolitionist philosophy would have us do nothing, and we need to do something. This change rests on a misunderstanding. It is perfectly consistent with the philosophy of animal rights to take a gradual approach to end animal exploitation. It is just that the steps that need to be taken must themselves be abolitionist in nature. What would such abolitionist steps be like? Here are only a few examples. an end to the Dre's LD50 and all of the toxicity and irritancy tests, an end to the use of animals in product testing, an end to the use of animals in maternal deprivation, military and drug addiction experiments, an end to commercial whaling, an end to the killing of elephants, rhinos or other big game, and an end to the commerce in fur. As far as the billions of animals used for food are concerned, the abolitionist means is found in education. Those who advocate animal rights must seize the vegan initiative that contemporary society, for a variety of reasons, presents to them. Americans are in unprecedented numbers prepared to stop eating non-human animals and animal byproducts, and the advocates of animal rights should direct their time and effort to getting those ranks to swell through education and rational persuasion. A no veal at any meal campaign, not eat happy veal raised in larger social units, is the realistic abolitionist place to begin. Abolitionist philosophy divisive. Some activists might object that the demand for abolitionist purity will divide the animal rights movement and thereby slow its progress. Some have even gone so far as to denigrate the philosophy, which we, along with many thousands of grassroots activists, espouse as the new fundamentalism. This is, in our view, an unfair, harmful pejoration of a serious, well-developed philosophy, and represents the type of rhetorical excess activists have learned to expect from image makers in the employ of the American Model Association, or the American Farm Bureau, but not from persons committed to working to advance the struggle for animal rights. These issues to one side, we believe that a clearer understanding of the two philosophies, animal rights and animal welfare, coupled with the determination to work for abolitionist means to abolitionist ends, does not divide people otherwise united by their commitment to animal rights. Rather, it serves to clarify whether any unity exists in the first place. The acceptance of our position does not mean that animal advocates, whether adherents of animal rights or animal welfare or others, must be at constant war with one another, or that those who advocate animal rights should strike a holier-than-thou pose. There is plenty of room for justified humility by everyone, plenty of opportunities for displaying tolerance and patience towards people who are just beginning to think about the issues, and plenty of occasions calling for cooperation among the partisans of conflicting philosophies. From educating the public about how badly other animals are treated, to joining forces on specific actions, such as the Higgins pigeon shoot, opposition to particularly egregious research, students' rights in the classroom, anti-fur campaigns, but it is our view that animal rights organisations should pursue animal rights campaigns and not spend their human and economic resources on projects that seek to promote the welfare but do not vindicate the rights of non-humans. The purpose of our remarks is not intended in any way to disparage the efforts of people who perform acts of kindness towards animals. People can clearly help animals even though they do not share the rights perspective. We are talking here about the future direction of the animal rights movement, and although we value those individual acts of kindness that result in the amelioration of animal suffering, the movement simply cannot afford to formulate its philosophies, policies, strategies and campaigns so that everyone who has any concern for animals will be able to agree on principles informing and directing the movement. To do so would be to adopt views that are so broad as to be meaningless, and that would frustrate rather than forward the achievement of animal rights goals. There will always be organisations espousing a moderate welfarist message whose primary aim will be attracting those people who have a genuine concern for animals, but who, for whatever reason, do not accept the rights position. Those organisations serve a valuable role in providing a niche for such people, who often evolve to accept a rights approach. Those groups, however, are not animal rights organisations, and indeed they often quite explicitly disavow the rights position. Over the past several years, some groups that once advocated animal rights appear to have backed away from that position, claiming that they must have a position that will be comfortable for everyone who wants to help animals. But no organisation can be all the things to all people. Indeed, advocating an approach that everyone can live with is substantially certain to result in a position that will appeal to the lowest common denominator, and that will ensure that animal rights will remain an unattainable ideal. The larger social context. The philosophy of animal rights views the systematic exploitation of animals as a symptom of a society that tolerates the systematic exploitation of the other, including those human others, who lack the economic and other means to resist oppression. Thus, the philosophy of animal rights necessarily calls for human, not only animal, liberation, By contrast, the philosophy of animal welfare neither addresses nor advocates why and how justice for humans is to be achieved. The philosophy of animal rights is an inclusive philosophy. Rights for non-humans only make sense if we accept the total inclusion of our human sisters and brothers as full and equal members of the extended human family, without regard to race, sex, economic status, religious persuasion, disability, or sexual preference. Thus, the philosophy of animal rights entails far-reaching social exchange. Animal liberation is human liberation. The philosophy of animal rights illuminates why this, but it is no less true that a human liberation is animal liberation. To believe in and work for our oppressed and exploited brothers and sisters in fur and feather and fin commits animal rights activists to believing in and working for our oppressed brothers and sisters in human flesh. Perhaps our movement has not yet arrived at this degree of inclusion, but in our view, such inclusion to the goal to which our movement must aspire. Counterpoint. Total victory, like checkmate, cannot be achieved in one move. By Ingrid Newkirk. With only an idea of what the point piece will say, it was not available for me to see. I doubt my commentary can fairly be called a counterpoint, because like Tom and Gary, I hold dear the vision of a world in which other than human beings are respected to the fullest. This is a most unrealistic view, of course, because no one has yet been able to reason, bully, or cajole human beings out of warmongering against one another, or even stealing from, cheating, and undercutting their own friends and relatives. Take, for example, the pettiness of group rivalries and the energy wasted arguing over which way is the best by every group of human beings, from model airplane enthusiasts to civil rights advocates. However, while utopia may be unattainable, most forms of animal slavery will be abolished, I'm sure, if we push for them without embarrassment or hesitation and force ourselves to accept that total victory, like checkmate, cannot be achieved in one move. Although I expect the point piece to be a well-reasoned call for us to go beyond the admittedly ridiculous, albeit in my opinion sometimes necessary, task of trying to regulate atrocities, I have a concern. Recently, I heard audiences being told that animal rightists must take an all-or-nothing approach. Further, that we must cast out animal welfarists and others who happen not to endorse that speaker's own views on issues involving not only other than human beings, but our own species. It was a very destructive call. My appeal here, therefore, is for us to always try, at least, to be constructive in our criticisms, welcoming to all new arrivals and tolerant of people who are trying in their own diverse ways to help animals, even if we don't agree with them. I will go to bat for animal welfarists, many of whom I respect enormously and consider my dearest professional friends, to argue briefly that there are pitfalls in attempting to reduce the membership of animal rights movements to purists, whatever each of us imagines that to mean, and give an example of why I believe that each step in the right general direction can only bring us closer to our ultimate goal. Steps in the right direction. To take the last point first, here's the example. Some years ago, the government was about to succumb to pressure from their cattle industry to withdraw a requirement that cows and steers awaiting slaughter, sometimes for up to 3 miserable days, be given water while they wait. Water, they reasoned, is expensive, and the cattle are going to die anyway. Animal protectionists began circulating petitions trying to counter the influence of the cattle lobby. I sent some of these petitions to a vegetarian community asking for signatures, but the petitions were returned unsigned. A note that came back with them read, "We are ethically opposed to the slaughter of animals for food, therefore we cannot get involved." Luckily, the water requirement remained in place, but I cannot imagine how those vegetarians with clean hands who declined help could explain their politics to the poor cows, sitting in the dust with parched throats. The issue was not to slaughter them or not, it was to water or not. Sometimes philosophy can get in the way of helping animals suffer less during the many years before they achieve the rights we wish for them. Movement purity. Secondly, in regard to purifying our movement, only dead people are true purists, feeding the earth and living beings rather than taking from them. Most vegans drive cars, buy consumer goods and live in buildings that have displaced hundreds to thousands of other than human beings. We know it is impossible to breathe without hurting or exploiting. We can simply try to keep improving and eliminating old habits we don't need. At the Alliance conference last summer, I listened to two people who have each contributed enormously to people's understanding of animal rights. They addressed the audience within minutes of each other. One argued that to be consistent, people who are fighting for animal rights must be pro-choice. The other argued that to be consistent, we must fight for all life, even that of unborn babies. Each was sincere, vehement, and wholly committed to her position on abortion. The animals, judging by what is going on in slaughterhouses and on mink farms, among other places, need the good works of both speakers and everyone in the audience. To ostracize one speaker, and perhaps half the audience who supports that speaker, because his or her opinion on abortion does not conform to mine, would diminish our collective work in areas where we do agree. All walking the same road. Finally, RE welfarists, imagine that there were no anti-cruelty statuses in America, and that we were starting from scratch and trying to persuade people that animals are not ours to eat, wear, experiment on, or use in entertainment, and so on. It is only within the last 100 years that the animal welfarists have worked to compel society to accept the cruelty to animals. Beating lame horses who no longer had the strength to pull heavy carts, drowning crates of stray dogs in rivers, that sort of thing, is more than wrong. It is illegal. Incidentally, the public's perceived self-interest prohibited it from accepting the anti-vivisectionist movement, even though it emerged at the same time as the humane movement. Thus, the circa 1890 anti-vivisection societies became dormant for some decades. It is certainly thanks to the welfarists, many of whom have embraced animal rights, but some who still have bull roasts, breed purebred dogs and do other things, I wish they wouldn't, that we are now able to springboard into animal rights. It is also thanks to them that spaying and neutering, euthanasia as opposed to drowning, bludgeoning, electrocution with jumper cables, death by inhalation of hot filthy carbon monoxide, and humane education are no longer considered radical ideas. Frontline welfarist workers' jobs are lousy, thankless and stressful enough as it is without animal rights purists jumping all over them. Yes, euthanasia is a miserable solution, but if any euthanasia critic out there knows where they can put the 14,000 unwanted animals who will come through just one of my area shelters this year, please drop me a line. Those who offer living deaths and slow deaths, furriers, butchers, experimenters, guard dog companies and people who think an acceptable home need only mean food, water and air need not apply. It is almost impossible for even one of us to find another of us who agrees on everything we hold true. Some people hunt but believe the Higgins pigeon shoot is cruel. Some are vegan but still believe that some animal experiments are justified. Differences are the norm. What's important is where we agree. Wherever we decide to put our own energies, time and money is our decision. We can disagree heartedly as to what will bring about animal liberation the soonest, but all of us are guessing, so let's not try to undermine each other and the accusory nature of each other's motives. We are, after all, walking along the same road, changing our behaviours as we go, stalling periodically, but trying to find the strength to do what we believe is right. May Tom and Gary's article be the positive voice of the loud howling wolves who arouse the jades that drag the tragic melancholy night.